Project Lawful aka Planecrash by Arwayne aka Eliezer Yudkowsky and Lintamande. Crisis of Faith, Episode 167.
There's one particular preserved city that's supposed to be super forbidden, for no declared reason, and my guess is that one is just a trap for people like your son. Possibly where they manage to cleverly make their way past all the defenses, search the city, learn some plausible, incredible secret, and get to go home and be smug about being the only ones who know, and never realize how obviously they were being manipulated. Not that I'd be saying this out loud if I were still in Dathilon, of course. For the rest of that, sure, that's all very reasonable if it's free. Do you also just eat cookies because they're tasty, and not consider that you're supposed to pay for them?
What does super forbidden mean? They kill you more slowly? Sincere best guess expected to be wrong. The reason you pay for cookies is because another person's labor produced those cookies in anticipation of a market, and there would be no cookies in a world where we steal them instead of paying for them. Common knowledge. It is not because if someone says something is costly, you should care about that.
No, that they tell you very emphatically not to do it. We literally never do the torture thing. So to me, it feels obvious that you want to be the sort of planet where, if something weird happens, people can successfully coordinate to deploy an appropriate weird response, in much the same way that you want to be a planet where people can produce cookies and not have them get stolen. There should be some procedure for figuring out whether you need to bury all your old cities, and then everybody does that, which includes sensible aspects like firing everybody in your government, occasionally sending somebody on a one-way trip to the pole of the world where they report back using codes on whether the real reason seemed legit, that sort of thing. If there's no possible procedure which does that, then your world is defenseless against any problem requiring that response, and probably lots of other problems too. Attempted chain of valid inferences with overtones of moral inveighing.
To me, it seems, to protect against some classes of danger is to make yourself more defenseless to other classes of danger. Assertion with defense of it upcoming. A strong king protects against external threats, but risks becoming a tyrant. Common knowledge. A compliant populace protects better against some problem where you need to ban all of the past, but protects worse against some problem where the government decides to ban all of the past, not acting in the interests of the people. A society that is inhospitable to people like Telkar is more likely to be making errors that being Telkar prevents. A society full of Telkars will, of course, barely be able to solve any problem that cannot be solved by shooting it or running off to live in the wilderness or overthrowing the government. There is no society that is defended against every possible direction of danger. So then there is only the question, how frequent are good reasons to ban all of history, compared to how often will kings manipulate the populace to that end when it weakens the people? I think probably 1 king in 10 would do that if he could, maybe 1 in 5. Certainly Cheliax is attempting it. So good reasons would need to be frequent indeed, for that trade to seem wise. Attempted chain of valid inference.
That stakes civilization's survival on never being wrong in advance about how often some weird situation actually comes up. Instead of having a weak government so that it can't become tyrannical, we have a somewhat stronger government with emergency weapons behind locks, not controlled by the same people who can use those weapons, and run the annual oops, it's time to overthrow the government festival to rehearse the motions needed to overthrow it if required. We don't have a population that goes along with anything the government says. We have a population that will tell the government it will go along with weird things, but only if the whole government quits, and we use a paper cryptographic protocol, mathematically trustworthy procedure everybody can carry out using paper, to recreate a new government entirely from scratch in a way that would be very difficult for a conspiracy to manipulate. You can optimizedly design being able to defend against more situations instead of just saying, oh, well, I guess there's a trade-off. Let's stake everything on guessing the right side of the simply formed trade-off.
If you have a population that will not go look in the hidden cities, because they were told they should not. You have staked everything on guessing the right side of the trade-off. Confident.
Not seeing why. Life goes on, people continue earning money and spending it. Almost nobody dies for real and nobody ever gets tortured. What goes wrong if we don't look in the hidden cities, and should have?
What goes wrong? Rhetorical. Your government is lying about the frozen people, and if they come back, everyone dies for real. Your government is lying about no one gets tortured. You have afterlives, and they are bad, or some are bad, and you don't know enough to avoid those ones. Your people had invented something much, much better than life goes on, people continue earning money and spending it, but some powers wanted to stamp it out. And now instead of trading with every star, you are stuck poorer, and they will do it again if you rediscover it. This is the 80th time it has been done to your civilization, by some power that wants you at your current level of strength, but not bigger or stronger. You are ruled by a secret cabal of aliens that are mind-controlling your government, and you do not learn it. Maybe also they eat people, if you do not mind being ruled by a secret cabal of aliens. There is some terrible threat to your world that sealing away history means you do not know of and might now unleash. Your world does have gods and magic, but in sealing away history, you ensured that only a small ruling elite will know of them. You would have been able to figure out Cheliax much, much faster if you had known how history is. Oh, I wasn't supposed to talk to you about that. Apology.
I think our people could legitimately not optimize for their true dead ending up in worlds they'd decrypt faster if they knew the hidden history. That seems like a legitimately hard call. By the same token, you could say that there is an afterlife in Dathilon, which most people didn't know about, and our keepers probably did infer in a very general way, namely, people like me ending up places that turned out to be here. It's not hell, but I'm not having much fun right now. And civilization did the correct thing about that by cryopreserving almost everyone, so that they almost entirely wouldn't end up in places nobody could predict. I think this is hard to describe. Our world's physics, laws of reality, is much more closed and systemically closed than Galarian's physics. We know all of it. It is a single equation. It is contrary to the character of that physical law for us to easily trade with other stars. When I came to Galarian, I didn't worry about the correct things, because Galarian was such a different place. If you were suddenly transported to Dathilon, you wouldn't worry about the correct things either. Civilization thought of possibilities like your worries, as appropriate to Dathilon rather than Galarion, and defended against them. There is a powerful beacon far away where it would not be easy to destroy, emitting an invisible force akin to light but wider. That beacon, it's been passed down, marks the moment when history was erased, and sends signals spaced in a way that makes it easy to identify when that moment was. There is only one beacon like that, not 80, and it's very loud, so we wouldn't miss the others. If somebody said we had to erase our past again and destroy the beacon, I think people would be a lot more suspicious at that point. That's the point where it starts to look like somebody is trying to hide something or fool future generations and not just respond to a strange threat in a way where they're happy to let you take all the precautions required to make sure nobody's fooling anybody. I think the basic idea you're missing here is possibly something like the degree to which it's possible for a huge number of people to make a decision and know that it was their decision, using paper cryptographic protocols and so on. You think in terms of a small number of people being able to command the rest, not in terms of an argument where everyone evaluates it and comes to the same answer because everyone has been trained in the same rules of generally valid argumentation, and then people can act in unison from there.
People want very many weird things. If aliens came to Galarion with an alien mind virus, even if everyone were sure the decision was theirs, the decision would not be close to unanimous, even if they followed the same rules of reasoning. It is true that they don't, because all people except me and my wife and some of our smarter children are idiots. But even if they did, Some would say, submit to the aliens, and some would say, destroy the aliens, and some would say, unleash Rovagug, and some would say, have sex with the aliens, and some would say, screen off our history, and some would say, evacuate the planet, and they would not agree, even if they followed the rules of arguing, any more than gods agree, even though gods follow all the rules of arguing.
Presumably, your gods don't disagree on questions of fact, they just have different utility functions, things they want. That's not a disagreement, it's just having different utility functions. We're not gods, but we try not to fall too far short of godhood. Disagreeing about whether 2 plus 2 equals 4 doesn't make you a cognitively diverse nonconformist, it makes you bad at math. This scans, but in the way of a real rhyme, not central cheating poetry.
Yes, that is the word I was looking for. People on Golarion have different utility functions, so you would never get them to agree on screening off history, even if you made them all into gods.
Apparently, some people in Golarion will go to Elysium, get hell scried to them, and willingly return when resurrected, to serve Asmodeus in Golarion, and then in hell. Pilar said that under truth spell supervised by Osirian. Keltham says this in Taldane. It'd be too weird to try to use all the loanwords in baseline. Dath Ilan is just straight up legitimately not that cognitively diverse. You want to brag about having more cognitive diversity here? You win. I'm not sure it's been good for your planet, but you win.
I actually don't know if Asmodeans count. They are all lied to until the part of their brain that notices lies is ignored, like a boy who always cries wolf. If you raised them somewhere else, they would not be like that.
I really would have thought I'd given some of them enough training in noticing self-deception to snap them out of that. Pilar noticed that she didn't want her family to go to hell, so her curse very sensibly arranged for them to get kidnapped by Osirian, atoned to lawful neutral, and killed, so they be in Axis. So she was seeing things, but she herself, whether she wanted to go to hell, and Carissa. Can you leave the room until I come out again to say it's okay? I need to have a brief crying fit, and the last one lasted 5 minutes. This one will probably be less.
I can do that. Probably there is some weird alien thing where it is fine to say, I'm going to have a crying fit, but not to cry?
It seems perfectly straightforward from a Dathalani perspective. Keltham is not trying to conceal the fact that he's in emotional distress. He's trying to not expose Faye Anar's wordless perceptions to the sight of somebody in distress that Faye Anar can't help, except by leaving him alone. And yes, maintain his masculine gender trope's pride against the wordless update that Faye Anar couldn't avoid making if seeing Keltham directly. Also, Faye Anar is not Keltham's girlfriend. Back.
Osirian men would in fact be far more reluctant to weep in front of their wife than in front of a stranger, but it does seem like the kind of thing where aliens might be different. When Keltham comes out, Feanar has cornered a servant and cast tongues on them and is chattering at them in baseline.
You know, theoretically your time's up, but I'm not going to stop because I'd rather not think about other things. And also, I just can't resist at this point seeing how far you can get on sounding like a native. Keltham will start repeating everything Feanar says the exact way a native speaker would say it, if they had Feanar's general personality, instead of Keltham's. A Dathilani can totally tell the difference between these two personalities. They're very distinct.
Keltham is great, and baseline is beautiful. He also thinks this about Osirian and Taldane and Kelish and Halit and Tien and Adlet and Sylvan and Protean. To be clear, it is not really specifically a compliment to the designers of baseline, but today they have filled his life with delight for which he wishes he could repay them. The servant will anxiously scuttle away.
Why did that person run away? I wouldn't run away if I'd suddenly found myself near an alien, for much the same reason I actually would look inside a preserved city if that was costless.
Because he's worried he'll do something wrong and offend the alien and get into trouble, probably. I think you're actually moderately difficult to offend, but people aren't going to assume that.
Actually moderately difficult, not actually moderately difficult. Correction towards more colloquial word choice and intonation, with no simple mapping onto distinct Taldane phrases. Are women here going to pretend they like me, because otherwise they're afraid they'll get into trouble?
If you marry them, I guess they're reasonably likely to do that. Honestly, you strike me as too young to get married, and I would not recommend it.
Frankly, you strike me. Not honestly, you strike me. Dathilani don't lie often enough that they need to say when they're being honest, but they conceal things often enough to say when they're being frank. People here are immune to concerns about other people getting upset with them, or won't try to hide or alter their apparent feelings around people unless married to them. That sounds like the literal opposite of how I think things should work.
Women will lose standing and respect from their peers and superiors if they're being friendly with you. So they'll probably only do it if they are strongly motivated to by internal concerns and not by fear of getting in trouble. The one context in which social pressure points in the direction of more friendliness for women is towards their husbands, if they are married. So if you married a woman here, then you might reasonably worry she was subject to social pressure to pretend she liked you. You can of course avoid this pretty easily by not marrying anyone until you are older and wiser.
Definitely not marrying anybody from Osirian until I'm at least older and wiser enough to understand the gender tropes, which is the standard library of terms that can compress descriptions of gender, which is the thing that people's personalities make of their sex, which is the axis along which almost everyone in Dathilan is born either male, which is what I am, or female, which is the shape males match.
Yes, that seems like definitely one prerequisite. Also, you'll need a stable income, which shouldn't be that hard, but me paying you to teach languages won't count to most families. And many women will have concerns about the harem in Cheliax. I generally say having a harem in Cheliax is outright disqualifying for marriage. But you're going to be very rich, and that compensates for most disadvantages.
Wow, you're tactless. It's not clear that I still should see myself as having a harem in Cheliax. Abigail was all like, "Everything you value here will be waiting when you return to us reading Lawful Evil." But she was not under a truth spell when she said it.
Well, formally having had a harem in Cheliax is still fairly disqualifying for most people, because what if one of the girls turns up here with your child? That's a complicated situation for a marriage to navigate if you're the kind who'd take her back. High uncertainty. I'm really not a good person to give marital advice. I only have one wife myself.
Signed a contract requiring them to use alter self, which Lirilatha said was effective in preventing pregnancy, having a child, so that should work if they're actually bound by contracts and Lirilatha couldn't lie. Does that match your understanding? I mostly don't want to talk about this, but should check that part. He needs to send back a message requiring them to use alter self one final time. Carissa was so happy. When he's just had a crying fit. Keltham is not really okay with himself having another one so soon after, so he won't, this time.
Cheliax will obey their contracts, unless there's something sneaky in the wording. I don't know what to make of the idea of having women shapeshift until they aren't women, but I think my objections are not that it wouldn't work.
I'm confused. They weren't shifting during sex. Well, Maritzol, but she was shifting into other women. It was her thing. They were shifting male afterwards to prevent pregnancy.
In the Osirian conception, the core thing that makes someone a woman is the capacity to bear children, and the core thing that makes someone a man is the capacity to sire them. There are also differences in personality traits and virtues and aptitudes and so on, but in Axis, where no one can bear children and no one can sire them, those are smaller than, say, the differences between different species, and it certainly wouldn't make very much sense to have laws about them. So in the Osirian conception, a person who shapeshifts frequently enough to ensure they cannot bear children isn't exactly meaningfully a woman. They have departed from womanhood to be something else.
Wait, so a woman can own property here. She just needs to learn alter self and shapeshift frequently enough that the system doesn't classify her as a woman anymore. Or is it that only men can own property, so if I make second circle and change to being a woman once per week, the government can declare I'm no longer a man and take all my stuff?
Neither of those, but closer to the first one. Spellcasters can get classified as the head of an independent household, even if they're women, and widows past childbearing age can get classified as the head of their household, even if they're not spellcasters.
Also, does your society have like one gender trope? Or two gender tropes, I guess. In Dath Ilan, there's a lot of different ways to be a man or a woman, or like do your best to resign from the system because you are a cognitively diverse nonconformist.
Well, if you are a man and want to resign from the system, you can cut off your genitals, I suppose. Being a cognitively diverse nonconformist doesn't really strike me as strong enough reason for that, but perhaps it is my turn to have underestimated how much people vary.
No, I mean, this is Dathilani male-coded clothing I'm wearing, and I maintain my hair in a way that looks Dathilani male. I could stop doing those things, and people in civilization would still be able to identify me as probably having male genitals, unless I did a lot more work. But they wouldn't assume that I'd behave in a masculine way. There's a way of being a woman where you try to maintain a high sex drive so you can keep a harem of men you like, the haremistress gender trope. There's a way of being a woman where you don't have sex and marry a man who's married to a different woman so that you can get snuggles without fucking, the asexual, non singular mete gender trope. There's a way of being a woman where you don't like people drawing inferences about you just because you're female, which is the singleton, non-binary gender trope held in common across all sexes. A singleton is, there's only one object that exists inside the class for that object. It sounds like Osirion has one feminine gender trope, and if you don't fit it, they stop thinking you're a woman, which, like, I'm pretty sure if I was a woman, I'd go off the standard gender trope here, just so that I could own property.
I don't actually know where the source of this confusion is, but I suspect it of being somewhere very distant from the conversation that we're having. It is true that in Osirion, women do not marry multiple men, because then the paternity of their children would be in question, and it's bad for children to not have a father who is committed to providing for them. It strongly predicts dying of starvation as a baby.
Should have noticed earlier that this conversation was probably heading towards a Golarian doom fact. It's not easily possible in Dathilan to have enough children that the mother's job alone couldn't support them, unless she had an unusually low-paying job or she tried for like 12 kids or something. I'd ask if being able to test for a handful of genetic markers, narrowing down paternity. Genetic being the tiny storages of information inside people that implement heredity, the way children resemble their parents, would solve that problem. But unless the explanations I got in Cheliax were lies or not typical of Galarian, I suspect the answer is no. There's some huge tangle of people being insane in a way that you can't change by changing the facts. Sort of don't want to go into that, because it was something that Carissa would always take the responsibility of explaining to me. Unless it actually is just testing for genetic markers to determine the father, in which case I could think about if there's some simple way to do that at your tech and magitech level.
That seems like a good thing to have that many people would pay a lot of money for. I don't know that it would solve the problem you perceive, because I don't think I exactly understand the problem you perceive, but I don't see an obvious problem with a woman having two husbands if they can afford to check which is the father, and both have agreed in advance that the responsibilities of the father attach to them, if the spell indicates it's them. I don't think it'd be a very popular arrangement, but I don't see why people who want the option shouldn't be able to buy it. People mostly do things for good reasons, and changing the facts does change how they behave. But a lot of facts are connected with other facts, and people don't change instantly.
Yes, much of the childhood training I got in being able to propagate updates more quickly and change my mind faster does make more sense to me as a vital necessity of a stable civilization, now that I realize that in the absence of this training, people will spend 10 years acting like second circle wizards can get pregnant by accident. Once I know the differences between Osirion and Cheliax, I'll just update on them. I won't complain about how facts are entangled with other facts. I'll just propagate all the updates I know how to propagate. You can move faster if you're not afraid of speed.
I guess now I should try to explain gender in Osirian and associated facts to you, but I'd really rather someone else do that, because it sounds really unpleasant. Maybe less so if we do it in baseline, so I can practice my baseline. Do you want me to do that?
Realistically, that should not happen to me today. You want to go back to telling me about how Dathilan's government just had to be secretly awful? Got a lot of that in Cheliax, too, only in retrospect, without nearly the emphasis on how they thought there was any possible alternative to that.
That sounds like much more fun, yes.
Sometime later.
In the absence of gods, but the presence of talk control, I'm actually not sure how I'd organize a society to not be ruled by tyrants. If you have any one powerful person, they can be talk controlled. If you have no powerful people, you will be invaded. You could maybe do random selection of rulers for 1-year terms, though I think that just gets you ruled behind the scenes by some group of people that doesn't get turned over every year, presumably the keepers. Maybe the best you can actually do is tyrants who have to pretend not to be, which is what it sounds to me like Dathilan has.
The talk control we know about is not instant. Supposedly, even if you matched up a 9th-rank keeper against an ordinary Dathilani, they would still take 2 minutes, and anybody else watching would notice the conversation being very weird. But look, you're still angling at this from way too much of a Galarian perspective, where you control a handful of top people, and suddenly you control the society. If anything runs Dathilan, it's the prediction markets that say which observable outcomes we'll get in 10 years if we do something a particular way, and the legislature negotiates which outcomes we're steering toward. The designated desirable outcomes are a matter of public record. The prediction markets are things that anybody, including me, could bet on. If the dark conspirators want to actually steer around civilization, they need the prediction markets to be making bad predictions, presumably about the roads not taken, because on the roads actually taken you can see the predictions not coming true. And then the bids get revealed after the fact, and people would notice if their own bids were not listed, so you can't understate the bids in one direction. So you'd need there to be these huge, mysterious, opaque bidders coming in and bidding against all the people who did acknowledge their bids, to claim overly pessimistic outcomes on the roads you wanted to steer away from. You see the problem here? Maybe you can take over civilization in the sense of getting an achievement unlocked on how you theoretically control the minds of the 9 legislators, but that doesn't actually get you anything, so far as I can tell. The legislators can't say to steer for a weird outcome without everyone noticing, and civilization has definitely ever thought about somebody trying to take it over via breaking into some computers, shaped raw causal processes, and making the prediction markets too pessimistic about all courses of action other than the way they want civilization to go.
Like the prediction market of whether the dead will return, where you noticed exactly that kind of suspicious activity. Anyway, if you control the keepers and the legislators, you can declare things like that you're going to screen off all of history. I find it hard to believe you couldn't also declare things like that you need to launch a massive secret project almost no one is told about, or remove all works of fiction that might enable someone to learn the gods are real and contact them, or that you need to invent and refine talk control, or that you need to make a bunch of specific people who are criticizing you decide to freeze themselves. As far as I can tell, any high-rank keeper can go to the home of a critic who is particularly troubling to them, and in 2 minutes of conversation, convince that person to commit suicide. That is sufficient power to cover up a lot without manipulating prediction markets, even setting aside how you can use it to manipulate prediction markets in a way that's not very obvious. Especially if talk control works over mass media, you can do far more than that.
I'm sure there are massive secret projects we're not being told about. You can tell this because of how I think this is a totally reasonable thing to do, so long as they're pro-social secret projects with valid rationales. I would be horrified and disturbed to know that governance was not running massive secret projects, because there are clearly going to be some things like that, and somebody needs to do them. And if governance isn't doing them, then what are we even paying for? If the gods are real, then, yes, you'd want to remove all works of fiction that would let somebody contact them. This also seems like a totally reasonable thing to do. And there was, yes, a famous creepy incident where the keepers negotiated with a dissident faction, and then their leaders told all of their followers to go into cryonic preservation. But obviously the dissident faction took no precautions whatsoever against talk control, because the dissident faction was stupid, and that all happened in public where everybody could see how creepy it was because the keepers were stupid. false statement illustrating what the truth must be by contrasting to it.
At some point, you are just conceding, yes, we are a tyranny that has and routinely exercises the power to crush dissidents and ban the speaking of true important things that would dramatically change the life priorities of many of our subjects, and we like it that way.
The dissident faction in question was one that wanted to destroy all life before it could colonize the stars, so that we wouldn't spread the possibility of suffering through the universe, and the fact that our civilization is not so constructed as to entertain the possibility of crushing them was why our keepers had to negotiate with them secretly, using obvious protocols for avoiding known possible levels of talk control, like exchanging notes written on paper with delays built in that an intermediary person rewrote, and told the negative utilitarians something, struck a deal with them that made them voluntarily ask their followers to voluntarily go into early cryonic suspension in exchange. I can now guess that one of the things they were told was that truly dead people just end up somewhere else, like I did. And I can see all kinds of possible excellent reasons why the keepers would not tell everyone that. In Dath Ilan, we pay children who are still young enough to give in to threats. Every time we threaten them into doing something, every time we have to slap their wrists or threaten to slap their wrists, it goes into their bank account for later in life, so that we'll never do it lightly, and we'll notice it every time. In Dath Ilan, we have to persuade our dissidents who want to end all life to voluntarily go into early cryonic suspension instead of hanging around, trying to end all life, in exchange for a bargain the terms of which I do not know because we don't have the kind of civilization that would just kill them. I am not terribly well acquainted with Galarian, but I know that this is so far advanced ahead of anything you have here that, yes, I can see why you just wouldn't believe it. But then say you don't believe it. Say that you think I was just trapped inside another conspiracy lying to me my whole life. Don't take the world I'm describing to you, that is obviously far ahead of Galarian on tolerance of dissent, and try to redefine it as tyranny.
Dath Ilan actually doesn't sound ahead of, say, Absalom on tolerance of dissent to me. There are no things I'll be arrested for shouting in a public square in Absalom, and a lot of things I would be arrested for shouting in a public square in Dath Ilan. There are no books that I will be prevented from writing and distributing in Absalom, and a lot of books I'd be prevented from writing and distributing in Dath Ilan. Absalom does not violently suppress Rovagug cultists. Osirion wouldn't suppress people who were just trying to have lots of children who'd agree with them the universe should be destroyed and not actually planning the actual release of actual Rovagug. It wouldn't negotiate with them because there'd be nothing to negotiate because they could, under our laws, just go living their lives as long as they weren't actually trying to do a violent crime. You just said, if the gods are real then, yes, you'd want to remove all works of fiction that would let somebody contact them. This also seems like a totally reasonable thing to do, and that is a degree of social control that no Galarian society except perhaps Nidal attains. Rahadum bans all the gods and all their followers, but they don't ban works of fiction in which the gods are described. In many respects, Dath Ilan sounds lovely. I have conceded that perhaps the degrees to which it is an unusually oppressive tyranny is in fact better than many other possible ways it could be. For example, if you do have a problem with aliens sending you mind viruses. But I am not redefining anything when I name it an unusually oppressive tyranny with unusually little tolerance of dissent.
What exactly is an example of something you think would get you arrested in Dath Ilan if you shouted it in a public square where shouting was otherwise permissible, rather than a place where the people living there had designated it as quiet?
Iomedai is a powerful alien entity which can be contacted by shaping your thoughts towards her in the following fashion. Before we screened off history, there was a war in which 30 million people were killed. I have the documentation proving it. There is a secret government project too, followed by the details of any government secret projects.
Right, so I sure would get the heck out of that square, and then yes, I'd want that person removed from my city or rendered psychiatric assistance, as appropriate depending on whether what they were saying was true, false but lying, or false but honest. I think you have a fundamental presumption about governments acting in bad faith by default, which Dathilani straight up do not share. The thing where I don't rush out of the public square is if they shout, "There is a secret government project conducted in bad faith, which you can verify by looking at the following details." And then, they're probably crazy, but you maybe hang around and look up those purported details on the network, so that your society can maintain its theoretical ability to remove bad governments. Somebody shouting about a secret government project that the government was trying to keep secret for a good reason is just an asshole. No different from telling somebody about a surprise party their friends were going to hold for them, or the ending of the book they just started reading.
I agree that the reason Dathilani would arrest and exile this hypothetical person is because of the presumption of Dathilani that the government is operating in good faith. Would it resolve our disagreement if I said that Dathilan has unusually little tolerance of dissent and unusually much tolerance of the exercise of power to crush dissidents, compared to Galarian societies which are trying not to be tyrannies because of the presumption of Dathilani that the government is operating in good faith?
Think I'd first like to see how a woman selling sex was treated in those extremely free Galarian societies. Maybe inquire of them how they'd handle knowledge of the outer gods starting to propagate. Count the ratio of people imprisoned to people free, and interview some people who'd actually been arrested about what they'd been arrested for. Maybe offer them a truth spell about whether somebody had demanded a bribe from them. I am frankly skeptical that Galarian can get freedom right when it is too poor and too stupid to get anything else right.
Is the argument that while, in principle, Absalom's laws are much less restrictive, in practice, Absalom is sufficiently under-resourced in enforcing its laws and sufficiently unpredictable in a very weird case that it's easier to end up exiled unjustly from Absalom than to end up exiled from Dathilani cities? That seems true, though it still seems to me that it's important that Absalom is not the only city that does not have laws about evangelism and book writing, and it'd be very hard to end up unjustly exiled from all of them. So the problem somewhat reduces to making travel cheaper.
You know, now that I think about it, I'm sure on reflection that somewhere in Dathilan there is a city full of people who are just excitedly analyzing all the markets and figuring out all the secret government projects and slapping hands with each other as they figure them out, because the people there want to hear about it, and their access to the markets and so on has some kind of monitored trading condition that prevents info there from leaking out to the rest of civilization, which doesn't want to hear about it. But if they're calling down the gods on the rest of us, then yes, that is a condition under which I'd agree with a secret government project to go in and preemptively cryopreserve them all, and hide that fact from the rest of civilization. In fact, I think that's a much more important capacity for a society to have, now that I've seen a society where gods are running loose. Before, I would have said that was an unreasonably improbable hypothetical. Civilization is doing fine without gods.
As far as you know, not living in one of the places where people know what the government is doing.
If the government was doing something wrong, they'd obviously tell the rest of us and collect the huge bounties we'd pay out retrospectively for their assistance in having done that. I project with great confidence that this is, totally that city's motto, that they're a check on governance that way.
You don't even know if they exist. You should not feel sure they're being a successful check on the government.
If they don't exist, it's because all the people like that decided that any other people advertising themselves as that would be obvious traps and did their own homework instead. But mostly, I'd guess with great confidence there's a city like that because they'll think some people ought to check collectively rather than individually, even given the surety that assuming dark governance half of them are governance plants, and they'll generate a random number and look for a city of fellow conspiracy theorists would be the obvious baseline term to coin, with 80% probability. There's some cities you realize will exist as soon as you think about them, and they actually exist, 90% of the time or so. To be clear, this is not how the actual checks on governance work. Those are designed by very serious people and cunning masterminds having way too much fun.
Sometime later.
There is a saying out of Dath Ilan about conversations like these. It goes, Some conversations have no natural endpoint, and so you can only decide to say, it is complete because it ended here.
Oh, I was assuming at some point my son would send in his guards to drag me off you, but that works too. His baseline is more or less fluent at this point. A pleasure meeting you, Keltham of Darthilan. I hope Darthilan is not secretly evil, and also I hope we grow up to surpass them.
No, we should hope they were secretly evil. Bad news about the past is good news about the future. If you learn that some hidden problem obtained about the otherwise observationally fixed past, that's good news, because the past's quality level is not thereby changed, so you can fix that problem and get a better future than previously expected. If Dath Ilan was secretly evil, surpassing that quality of living standard in Golarion will be much easier, because Dath Ilan had that standard of living, despite being handicapped by being evil. Your baseline is functionally perfect in syntax and pronunciation. It's just missing vocabulary size, non-rule controlled intonation, common phrasings and proverbs, and, if you genuinely wanted to be able to pass as indistinguishably native, making the sort of technical arguments that Dath Ilani would make. Vocabulary you can get off tongues or from share language, baseline, that I tap somebody with. Common phrasings have to come from me, and I don't have them mentally stored in a format that lets me rattle off a complete list. Perfect intonation is going to require at least listening to me talking for long periods, and possibly continued active correction, an argument form is full-blown being as lawful as we were. How do you want to play this?
I'll pay for your time at today's prices if you think of more things you want to teach me or argue about, up to a total of 40,000 GP, which is all of my money.
You seem kind of noticeably intelligent compared to most people I've met in Golarion, and for that matter, me. Counterproposal. What if you followed me around while I was teaching things and tapped people with communal share language, baseline, so I could teach in baseline, which would converge towards you being able to share the whole language, because every time I said something in baseline not covered by your version, you or other people would query it, and then you'd also know that part?
I would be delighted.
Am I correct that you're the sort of person where, if I asked whether we're friends yet, and the answer was no, you'd just tell me no and not feel particularly uncomfortable about it either?
There's only any other sort of person, because most people are not very smart.
Right, so I'm pretty massively traumatized by the Chelish gaslighting operation, and rather a large part of me does not think that anything on this next layer of reality is real. It seems to me like inside that layer of reality we are forming something like a friendship, but I'm not sure I'm going to be able to let myself feel that, because my brain is constantly firing warnings of the form. Hey, if you start liking this guy, he's also going to turn out to not be real. And then that will hurt when you inevitably find out that this layer of reality was also a lie, and you have to leave it. Want to try forming a friendship under those somewhat adverse conditions?
That doesn't bother me. The more significant barrier is that I don't have a confident read on whether I respect you intellectually yet. I really enjoy talking to you, and you frequently surprise me in intelligent and interesting ways. But I don't know how much of that is you knowing lots of things I don't know, and how much is going to persist once I understand the world you're from. I'm also slightly worried you're going to declare war on hell or something, and it'll be politically complicated for me to participate in the war on hell in light of how my son is an aspect of Abadar, who I bet is constrained in going to war with hell, though it's actually possible he's just patiently waiting for us to make him an offer.
Odd good point. I am probably going to be all kinds of theologically and politically complicated, yes. And thank you for appreciating the point where I am just a punk kid waving around a lot of knowledge developed by a civilization greater than myself. I'm not going to expect you to participate in the destruction of Asmodeus if there's prior political constraints about that. It's not a requirement of friendship with me. Frankly, I mostly expect, at this point in the development of the story, that I end up having to do it alone, in the end, because if not then... It's weird about the story development that ripped away all of my previous friends, and I can read the foreshadowing in the good gods talking about decision theory being complicated. See you around, Feanor. I've hopefully tired myself out to the point where I can eat something and then sleep again. Perhaps we'll end up as friends eventually.
Oh, I absolutely plan to participate in the destruction of Asmodeus. I wouldn't miss it. I just expect there to be a bunch of annoying intermediate steps. Also, I've decided I do like you. On the strength of your having concluded you're going to have to defeat Asmodeus on your own, even though I think you're wrong about that. See you around, Keltham.
If you wish to support this AI reading and others like it, please visit patreon.com/AskWhoCastsAI. Any help is appreciated. And thank you to executive producer John Doe 7776059.